word on the company that I work for, that I represent here today. So long story short, if you need a quant consultant, who you're going to call Define. So, and I have a background in model validation, in risk neutral pricing, in XVA and counterparty credit risk modeling. So worked in banking supervision for 2 years. Now back at Define, and did some practical experiments using machine learning techniques and other techniques in particular for accelerating prices. So today I'm going to talk a bit about what has happened in that field in the past couple of years. I'm going to include a brief excursion on what the supervisors have had to say on usage of machine learning in risk models. And then I'm going to talk about one pre-study. We did 2 pre-studies recently with our clients, and for time reasons I'm going to focus on just one of them, but the story is essentially the same for the 2. So let's start with a retrospection, and maybe first of all with an introduction of the topic itself. So we have heard also yesterday in Antonov's and Peter Bark's talks that there is a problem of approximating pricing functions which can take a very long time to evaluate, which are typically defined on a high-dimensional input data space, which have one-dimensional output. And there are indeed many ways of approaching this problem. The traditional way has been to try to develop bespoke fast solvers using, like, for instance, Fourier techniques. And these work in specific instances and mostly in low dimension only. Now there's a couple of generic interpolation, extrapolation, regression techniques, including model approaches like deep neural networks, which can be used to tackle this task. And which are promising also in the sense that, of course, I mean, if you're lucky, you can build a fast bespoke solver, but building it, doing all the model validation also can be quite expensive. So can this possibly work? I'm going to now show a very trivial corner case, that of, a smooth function of just one input variable. So clearly, the problem can be solved in that simple case. Using, for instance, the Chebyshev polynomials. We have exponential convergence, nothing to worry about. So the problem really starts with high-dimensional input spaces. But that says, so the situation is not hopeless. So this is just a selection of papers that have been published over the past couple of years. It's by no means exhaustive. I didn't mean to leave anyone out. It's maybe a personal, maybe not even a preference, but what I've seen, what I've looked at. I haven't looked at all papers, I have to admit. So in 2018, Gaslau, Marstedt, and Meyer published a paper on how to do Chebyshev polynomial interpolation in higher dimensions. I mean, these are formulas. They are in higher dimensions, not really numerically implementable due to the curse of dimensionality, but I mean, at least mathematically, that's where to find them. Then in the same year, Ferguson and Green have applied deep neural networks to pricing equity basket options. So yesterday we saw another very interesting technique using tensor trains to do this in a fast way, but so they use deep neural networks. So in 2019, my friend and former colleague Sascha Geier and I, and also Arthur Steiner from Define, we have applied DNNs to pricing of Bermuda swaptions, which will also be like the main theme of this talk. Huge and Savine have contributed to the topic in 2020 by telling us that, if we want to be able to use sensitivities of DNNs, we'd better train those to the sensitivities of the reference price that we want to approximate. Which, is obviously a reasonable thing to do if those sensitivities are available. So, then I, with this publication by Antonov, Kornikov, and Peter Bark, which told us how to deal with sort of extrapolation properties of DNNs, like have the DNN sort of scale to 0 outside a given compact set, and then just prescribe the desired extrapolation properties. Now we've already heard the talk on alternatives to DNNs in finance by Antonov and Peter Bark. And then I want to also mention the rules and so on, who have sort of worked on this Chebyshev technique and who have indeed managed to come up with some suggestions of how to tackle the curse of dimensionality using Chebyshev techniques. Okay, now a couple of words maybe on what the supervisors have published. They have published quite a lot, and obviously I cannot go into details here in this talk, but there has been one publication in particular by the German banking supervisor, by BaFin and Deutsche Bundesbank, on usage of machine learning in risk models in particular. And so I try to summarize some of the key messages of that publication in this column here. So the good news is the regulation doesn't really change. It remains tech neutral, it remains principle-based and risk-oriented, and that framework in general is regarded as applicable also to machine learning techniques in risk models. That's a general statement, so that's a caveat. So when we talk about model changes, maybe for Pillar 1 models, that definition might require some refinement in order to avoid model drift happening. Like when you retrain a machine learning method on a daily basis, over time it can, because of the fact that it can move within a very general hypothesis space, can turn into a completely different model. So at some point you may need to say, okay, now that's a model change worthy of reporting to regulators. So that's something to talk about at some point when a model is actually production ready. Now, the supervisor also tried to characterize what machine learning actually is and how it is to be distinguished from classical models. And the notion of complexity of hypothesis space was brought up. So I'll say a few words on that in a minute. Data must be representative, and explainability is a central topic. Well, from what I've seen in the texts, it's probably not going to be a strict requirement to be able to interpret every single intermediate step. It's more about being able to explain changes in the outputs and trace them back to changes in the inputs. So anyway, explainability will of course be supervisory focus. So the way I interpret some of these theses, so I would say how to distinguish machine learning models from classical pricing models. I mean, they are also complex. I mean, they can also allow maybe a variety of functions. Well, here I would say the hypothesis space is a space of possible pricing functions is motivated by causality, and the actual hypothesis, i.e. the pricing function, is obtained deductively from selected data via calibration. And for machine learning, it's more like I have a generic hypothesis space, can be anything, and the model hypothesis is obtained inductively by looking at examples, as we heard in today's morning session, via training. So that's how I distinguish the words calibration and training. But it's more philosophical comment, really. So representative of data, the samples that we use for generating our examples should cover the relevant parts of the input data space, which can be huge. It's very high dimensional in general how to place the nodes in that space. It should be representative, and what that exactly means depends on the use case. Like if you do a value at risk computation, you maybe want to put your points in the input space so that they are distributed just like they are going to turn out to be distributed in a typical VAR computation. Now explainability. In this specific context, I would say it's important to control the approximation error. And if you're able to do that, either mathematically or just in terms of a suitable control process, then explainability in some sense is inherited from your explanatory reference model. So it's, I would think, a way to convince supervisors that explainability is guaranteed. Like if you can say, okay, I have a process in place which monitors my machine learning method on an ongoing daily basis, what can possibly go wrong. That's maybe a way of reasoning here. So then in terms of validation, I think standard model validation techniques can be leveraged and can also be labeled explainable AI techniques in some way. Like you can do backtesting, you can do sort of scenario analysis, you can shift certain parameters, a parallel shift of the yield curve, look at whether you have the expected monotonicity properties, you can do parity relation analysis and so on. Right, that's what I wanted to say here on the supervisory side. And I see, well, long story short, I regard these publications as encouragement to explore usages of machine learning in risk models. Well, I'm not saying everything's going to be accepted, but at this time, I think we can regard this as an encouragement. Okay, so now that's one of our clients, NRW Bank, where we did a pre-study, and yeah, so NRW Bank is a state development bank, has around 150 billion worth of assets as of 2021. They hand out loans and they refinance those loans. So they compute value at risk on a daily basis, and for limit management purposes, and also on a monthly basis they compute economic capital using one-year time horizon and stress volatilities in their VAR computation. And this includes loans, so interest rate risk in the banking book is included here. Use a Monte Carlo simulation, 3,000 scenarios. So now, why are loans interesting? Because by German law, fixed rate loans have embedded optionality. So after 10 years, with a notification period of 6 months, the borrower has the American option to exit the loan at no cost. And that has a significant pricing impact and significant risk impact, as we shall see. So these need to be priced, these American options, in VAR. And here we are going to assume rational exercise. Irrational exercise is something even more complicated. So VAR computation takes 55 hours, 44 of which are needed for pricing these embedded options. So it's really a game changer if we can speed this up. Okay, so here I have just drawn a picture. This is a loan, constant notional, i.e. no prepayment. And if you want to cancel it, you need the opposite cash flows and you need to repay. So if this all cancels, you end up with this flow structure. So the flows you need for cancellation are those. And from a present value perspective, those are equivalent to a forward starting plain vanilla swap. So this is about Bermudan, or more accurately, American option pricing. How is this done at NRW Bank? So they were nice enough to give me permission to talk about all of this. So thanks to them. They have a vanilla loan pricer, and they have obviously a Bermudan option pricer, which is a calibrator and a PDE solver. They use, who would have guessed, a one-factor Hull-White model. And for each and every trade, they price that trade by first calibrating that model to coterminal swaption structure. So now how can we apply machine learning in this context? We have the vanilla loan pricer, we have a PDE pricer, we have a calibrator, and we end up with a scenario price. We need to run all of this in every scenario generated by the VAR engine and for every trade. We can replace the PDE pricer by a machine learning technique or by a fast pricer, however you want to call it. We can independently replace the calibrator and the PDE pricer. We can replace a combination of the two. And we can even just look at all three components at once and try to approximate the whole package. So we are going to focus really on the, on the PDE pricer. And these other cases will only be considered by setting the option price to 0 and by using a linear approximation of the entire package. But then using all sensitivities that are available, first order sensitivities. Okay, that's one way to slice and dice the situation and to apply machine learning methods. So there's another slicing and dicing topic coming up. So I've drawn here a set of traits, and the shape tells us the amortization type. We can have linear amortization, we can have continuity traits, or we can have irregular traits. The color is supposed to tell us about the currency. So of course, we want to be able to just hand a trade and a market scenario to our pricer, and then we expect a price. But under the hood, of course, we can differentiate between different currencies and amortization types. So that's what we do for DNNs, which we used in this pre-study. For the Chebyshev methodology, which we also used, we slice and dice in a different way. We consider one model for every single trade. So we do not need to encode the trade characteristics. So for Chebyshev, one model per trade. For DNNs, one model per currency and per amortization type. Yeah, and we also sort of, for no good reason, except that we had very little time, we sort of decided to focus on linear amortization and trades with a 6 months amortization period. So before applying any method, it's good to think about normalization, of course, but also about pre-processing in a more general way, namely about going from the high-dimensional input data space to a possibly low-dimensional so-called latent space via some encoder map, and then to define the machine learning method on that latent space only. You can also decode, go back. This should be done in a way so that the identity on the latent space is recovered if you take the composition of these two maps. So the input data space here, in our case, includes trade data, granular trade data at cash flow level, yield curves, and model parameters, calibrated hull-wide volatilities. We did not look at implied swaption volatilities as market data as an input. On the latent space, we encoded the trade by looking at fixed rate, the time to maturity, time to first exercise, residual notional. And we encoded the market data by doing a principal component analysis on the yield curve. So principal component analysis not only can serve as a dimension reduction technique, but tells us also about the importance of the different axes. First order, second order, and so on. Here, importance in terms of what part of the variance is actually explained. And for generating training labels, one can do two things. One can either look at points on the input data space, project them to the latent space, and use the pricing function on these points in the input data space to generate labels. Then eventually what one is doing is a regression problem on L, on the latent space. Alternatively, one can use the decoder map to start out from points on the latent space, move them to the input data space, and then do the training. That's then an interpolation problem on the latent space. I was talking about PCA, so here's another thing we learned from Eugene Savin, that we should be careful about sensitivities. If the risk of our portfolio is orthogonal to the principal components of the market data as it is distributed in VAR, it's not a good idea to look at principal components of the market data, but one should be doing what they call risk PCA instead. So one should, in principle, look at the error one does by using this encoder map and decoder map, or even by using the machine learning function as well, in terms of expectation of error of gradient squared. So what's the variance of the error in the gradient? That's to detect cases where I have a trade which is sensitive only to a spread, but the principal component is a parallel shift, and it is insensitive to the parallel shift. So this needs to be included for sure in automated monitoring of the performance of the machine learning method. When you do a PCA, is the PCA actually capturing the relevant sensitivities? So here I was trying to illustrate why it may be a good idea to do upfront pre-processing. It's a Bachelier model, very simple case, and mathematically the projection doesn't change anything, but for the training algorithm it's much easier to operate on a low-dimensional space. So a toy model where I just say, okay, take forward rate as an arithmetic average of a couple of scalar rates. Taking that arithmetic average as an encoding can really significantly increase the speed of the training algorithm. Good, I have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to skip this slide because it explains what a deep neural network is, and I think everybody in this room knows that. So I'll spend maybe a couple of seconds on this slide talking about Chebyshev polynomials. So we have excellent approximation properties. If we do Chebyshev polynomial interpolation, even in high dimensions, only this exponent is obtained by taking the minimum of the degrees along the different dimensions. So if you have one dimension where you use an unsuitable degree, a low degree, this may really affect the performance of the entire method. Now, the idea by Ruiz and Zeron is to use what they call Chebyshev sliders, where you, first choose a coordinate system, maybe based on principal component analysis, and then you can say, okay, I'm going to use a two-dimensional Chebyshev tensor on the first two most important dimensions, and then a one-dimensional on the third one. This really means that you do Taylor expansion of your, say, analytical function. First step is Taylor expansion. So you say, okay, I want to see what happens in the direction of x and y. I want to see what happens in the direction of x. And what happens here in these areas where there are these holes, I just fill this in by using Taylor expansion and by neglecting the cross terms. So if the cross terms are zero, cross sensitivities are zero, that may be a good approach. Again, depends on the sensitivities and on the choice of coordinates. So, concrete example, f of x and y is x times y. The method fails horribly, but if you rotate your coordinate system, it works perfectly well. So it really depends on the choice of coordinates. Great. So I want to say something about model lifecycle management because it is really crucial for taking all of this live. You need ongoing controls, which may be based or should be based on comparisons to the reference pricer on a subset and not on all points, obviously. Otherwise, you don't gain anything. You need to think about what statistics you want to consider, like Kolmogorov-Smirnov statistics. You may want to have some visual things to work with, some plots. Yeah, so you want automated retraining, or at least you want to have automated warnings whenever retrainings might be necessary, when the market shifts, when the portfolio changes maybe, or when the pricing function changes, like when the mean reversion rate of a Hull-White model changes, which shouldn't be actually a parameter that you train to if it is called the same for all samples. So yeah, revalidation. I listed some sort of proposals for revalidation activities. Of course, you want to do an impact analysis, and you want to apply these AI techniques I mentioned in the beginning. Of course, you may also want to redevelop, maybe improve the model, maybe do differential machine learning, maybe you want to train to P&L instead of prices. Many options you have there. So of course, it should be only triggered when the performance goes down, deteriorates, and you cannot repair it just by retraining. Here it's important to have some technology in place which is called MLOps. So you don't need to keep track of your data and your code, and you should automate as largely as possible the generation of the documentation, I would say. Technical implementation, I'll be very quick. So we use this technology stack. We use Number for accelerating our DNNs, because if they are called sequentially, for whatever reason, we don't know why, they are actually quite slow. If you hand them tens of thousands of scenarios, no problem. But if you hand them one scenario at a time, they are quite slow. And the technology we found at the client necessitate serial evaluation. So we used this tool to accelerate the DNN itself. Yeah, so we developed some class hierarchy. We have a base class, and then the different models were derived from that one. We had some generic evaluator, which evaluated model in some test data and generic analyzer comparing two evaluators. So we could cross evaluate, like compare Chebyshev plus PCA against just PCA, like you encode, you decode, apply PCA for encoding, apply your reference pricer. That's that. Okay, now let me talk about the results. So we looked at 1,500 loans, 3,000 market scenarios under stressed conditions at a 1-year time horizon. So I have to admit we did not have the time to fully, to reasonably explore the hyperparameter space, but the experiments we did showed that really the learning rate is maybe the most crucial hyperparameter to tune. I'm not going to read what you have here, the slides are going to be available. So this is interesting because this shows you what happens if you just drop the optionality from the VAR computation. So you can see that the short option that the bank has reduces the bank's losses when interest rates increase, which is when the loans lose value. So we are in the loss area here, up to a certain extent, which is given by the PV of that option as of time 0. Whereas on the other hand, it really limits the gains, because if interest rates go down, at some point every rational investor will call the loan. If you have a fixed rate of 5% and the rates go down to 1%, you will definitely exercise your option. So normally the bank would make money as rates go down, but not really if the option is in place. So if you, here's the reference P&L, here the loan-only P&L, and these are quite different, as you can see. Here's the QQ plot, or on zoomed in on the left graph. So this is what happens when you do a linear approximation. Here you see that the points suddenly lie above the blue line. And that really means that you underestimate your risk if you do a linear approximation. The gamma really goes down as you go further and further out of the money, but you take the gamma that you have in the base scenarios, so you overestimate the risk reductive capacity of the option. So you underestimate your risk. So it's maybe not a great idea. This is what we obtained using a PCA and a DNN. So you see in the scatter plot there is some noise. In the tails, not so much. And the QQ plot is actually quite presentable, and certainly better than this one, especially in the tails. And this is what we got for Chebyshev. So the shape is a bit different. We have less noise around the base scenario. And again, a good QQ plot. So this is now a comparison of the different models. Zero option value, linear proxy, DNN, Chebyshev, full revaluation. And long story short, so you have different metrics like Kolmogorov-Smirnov metrics, L2 error metrics, relative error, and 5% quantile. The speed can be improved still, like by doing parallel evaluation, maybe use a GPU. But overall, the machine learning methods provide a decent trade-off. I mean, full reval is the most accurate, of course, but it takes 55 hours. And here we can get away with maybe 20 hours. So here I zoomed in on the left-hand side of this distribution, P&L distribution, and I put all these different methods on one graph. So we have, ignoring the option, doing the linear proxy, the reference, DNN, Chebyshev, and you see we overestimate the risk if we leave the option away. We underestimate it if we do the linear proxy, and with the machine learning methods, let me call them such, we are actually quite close to the reference. So we looked at another use case, highly exotic trade with large notional and using more training data, 30,000 Monte Carlo paths for pricing, and then 51,000 market scenarios. Problem is, once there's a trade event, like fixing event, the trade structure changes and you need to retrain. So we take time to the next fixing as an input, and just these two graphs to show you that it's really quite close. Relative error around 1%, mean relative error below 0.02%. 2 basis points. Okay. Here's another plot we used for analyzing our our networks here, you have like the reference price on the horizontal axis and the error on the vertical axis. So when you have a very flat galaxy-shaped structure, it tells you that the error is like uniformly small for all of these prices. Now, one of these XAI techniques I proposed was shifting the yield curve in a parallel way. So that's what we obtained. Let's maybe look at the graph in the middle. So the dark blue line is the reference. It has a hockey stick shape. That's for one single trade. The linear proxy is what it is. It's a linear proxy, and the DNN performs quite well on one side, and it oscillates on the other side, which is probably due to the fact that we didn't learn the sensitivities, so you can have oscillations. Here I also included Chebyshev, and Chebyshev is much smoother and doesn't oscillate. However, there's some sort of bias, apparently, which is probably due to the fact that the parallel shift was not really completely in the PCA space that we considered. So we are moving here at some angle to, now not parallel to actually the subspace we used for doing the Chebyshev tangles. Okay, so what are the next steps? NRW Bank has decided to enter into an extended parallel phase, which I think is a great idea. So they are going to run all of this, including this model lifecycle process, in production in parallel to the system that is actually used for creating numbers to be reported and numbers to be used for managing the bank. So they will gain experience, they may be going to fine-tune the method, maybe going to fine-tune the controls. And they're going to do this both for the embedded American options and for this highly structured single trade, which also uses 3 hours in var. So next steps, refinement of the methods, hyperparameter tuning, control of extrapolation behavior, maybe learning the derivatives to reduce oscillatory behavior, possibly, if you have the derivatives. The parallel phase, actually, I forgot to say that they want to do that for the DNN method. They could, of course, also do it for the Chebyshev technique. For Chebyshev, it's like one model per trade. If you have a new trade, you need to first build your Chebyshev model. Otherwise, you need a fallback logic in place. Slightly more complicated, so that's why they opted for the DNN-only variant at this point in time. And yeah, as I said, refinement of the ongoing monitoring and the model life cycle. So there are many things to be automated and to be done. Thank you very much. That's the end of my talk.